The CrowdStrike outage led to over 10,000 flight cancellations around the world, the UK National Health Service being offline, and banks like JP Morgan not operating properly. Today, we are living in an age when an IT glitch affects everyone, not just the techies. And this is why, as a business leader, you have to know what you can do to prevent it or at least to mitigate it. And that's what this episode is going to help you with. Welcome to the Tech For Non-Techies podcast. I'm your host, tech entrepreneur, executive coach, and Chicago Booth MBA, Sophia Matveeva. My aim here is to help you have a great career in the digital age. In a time when even your coffee shop has an app, you simply have to speak tech. On this podcast, I share core technology concepts, help you relate them to business outcomes, and most importantly, share practical advice on what you can do to become a digital leader today. If you want to have a great career in the digital age, this podcast is for you. Hello, smart people. How are you today? I really hope that your summer vacation plans have not been messed up by the CrowdStrike disaster. I've been feeling so sorry for all of those people stuck at airports, and I'm currently enjoying the summer season in London and the weather is glorious. And I was actually supposed to take a flight to France at the time of the outage, but thankfully my trip was postponed. And so I didn't have to howl in an airport, but I really do feel for those people. In today's lesson, I want to explain what happened in this whole CrowdStrike saga and share what lessons you as a business leader can learn from it, and so you could protect yourself as much as you possibly can. And this lesson is useful for anybody who has or will have any decision-making capacity at work. So if you're a startup founder or if you're a corporate leader, you need this. Today, I'm going to share the basics of how software should be released properly. And don't worry, it's not going to be technical and it will be really easy to understand. And some things are actually going to be pretty obvious. And I bet that at some point you will have to sign a contract with a software provider. And as a decision maker, you do need to understand what they do. So basically, you know what you're signing. And that's why we're doing this episode. And if you have listened to a few Tech For Non-Techies episodes already and you found them valuable, but you haven't yet subscribed, then, my darling smart person, this is the time. The time is now. In this podcast, I'm bringing you high-quality, free education that helps you to have a great career in the digital age. And the more you understand how tech and business work together, the more opportunities open up to you. And frankly, the more money you'll make. Wouldn't that be nice? And honestly, I think that makes it worth subscribing to a free podcast. In today's episode, you are going to hear the 5 lessons that every intelligent business leader needs to learn from the CrowdStrike outage. But before we get to the lessons, let's have a quick recap of what actually happened, because you've probably seen it in the news, but here are some actual facts. CrowdStrike is a cybersecurity company which sells its services to other companies like Microsoft. So Microsoft is one of its customers. So CrowdStrike itself is a B2B, business-to-business company that sells to Microsoft, which sells to consumers and to organizations. On July the 18th, 2024, CrowdStrike rolled out a software update, which then impacted its customer, Microsoft. And so then anybody who used Microsoft got impacted by it as well. The chief executive of CrowdStrike, George Kurtz, said that a fix had been deployed for a bug in an update, and that bug affected Microsoft Windows PCs. And that's a really popular product. And many of these PCs crashed, and some displayed what you might know as the blue screen of death, like when basically your PC is unusable. And happily, Apple Mac and Linux users were unaffected. I am a very happy Mac user, especially now. And as I'm sure you know, lots and lots of companies actually use Microsoft. So when Microsoft Windows PCs crashed, so did the systems of companies around the world. And the effects have been absolutely enormous. So over 10,000 flights have been cancelled globally. Oh my God. And Delta Airlines was the worst affected airline. And this is all happening during this summer vacation season my God, this really sucks. The British National Health Service said that the majority of GP practices had experienced disruption, and ambulance services reported increases in emergency calls from patients who basically couldn't contact the NHS otherwise. So that's really serious. That is the healthcare system of an entire country. And the financial system globally was also affected. So, for example, Vanguard, an asset manager with $7.7 trillion in assets under management, said that some of its web pages weren't loading, and the London Stock Exchange couldn't display company information, and company information is literally the lifeblood of trading. So basically, things were bad. And I could go on, but you get my point. The outage was massive, it affected normal people, and it affected huge, rich businesses. Microsoft, to their credit, released a fix the day after the outage, and slowly the world seems to be getting back to normal, and, there are still flights on the backlog. So, what can we learn from this? Well, I suppose you could basically become a hermit, never use any digital technology, and live in a cave. That's option one. If you don't want to take that option, then carry on listening to this episode. Lesson number one is that our IT systems are not foolproof. And it sucks to say it, but sometimes mistakes in software will just happen and they will have a real world effect. And that's why it's so important for business leaders to have a basic grasp of how software is made and managed, because basically it could hold you hostage. Leadership teams in companies have to have a process for when tech goes wrong, because at some point it will. And for you, just for you as my friend and as my listener, my biggest piece of advice is do not think that any technology is ever infallible. Remember the post office? Remember that disaster? The UK post office leadership team thought that their software was infallible, and they basically called it Fort Knox. And that led to them wrongfully convicting almost 1,000 people and driving one man to suicide. And then it turned out that they literally had an IT glitch in their system. So should they have learned something about technology, even though they weren't techies? Yes, they should. If you want to learn more about what happened at the post office, listen to episode 194, Lessons from the Post Office Scandal. That's an episode of this podcast, and I have also linked to it in the show notes. My point is, no technology can ever be perfect because software has to be updated regularly. So that's like why the apps on your phone change without you doing anything. It's because there are new software updates. So even if your current software works wonderfully, it doesn't mean that it will continue working well, because it will have to be updated, which is exactly what happened in this IT outage. Basically, IT risk is a business risk today, and you have to learn to evaluate it and to prepare for it. Lesson number 2 is before you release anything, test it properly. So this is obviously very relevant to people who are actually leading startups or who are in charge of a product team. But if that's not you, this is relevant because you're going to be buying software and you want to know how they test it. So I don't know what happened inside of CrowdStrike. I expect we'll probably find out quite soon. But the fact that they released a massive update and it had an effect on lots of computers around the world shows that they did not test it properly. Testing is a super important part of releasing a new piece of software. And you have to test the new software on different devices. So for example, if something works on your laptop, it might not work on mine because they're probably going to be slightly different versions. But testing can get cut if people are basically up against a deadline and are under pressure. And also I found that when there are bug fixes, then people can be a bit dismissive about testing for bug fixes. People, do not do this. If you're hiring a software provider, ask them about their testing and quality assurance process. If you're a startup founder, have a proper process. And yes, I have actually had to institute this process at my previous company, and it was boring because catching bugs is boring. But you know what's not boring? Being on the front pages as the CEO who basically brought down the world for a bit. So you don't want that. Anyway, if you're hiring a software provider, ask them about their testing and quality assurance process. And even if they give you a stock answer, which to be fair, they probably will, you will look like you know enough to be dangerous. And that's a good thing. Okay, lesson number 3. Before releasing on a big scale, release on a small scale. After a software has been tested, you might be tempted to release it to everybody, or the company you're working with might say, we've just got this new thing and we're releasing it to everybody. This is stupid. If you're in a tiny startup and you've got like 20,000 users, then release it to everybody. Honestly, 20,000 sounds like a lot, but it's not. But listen, if part of the world's infrastructure depends on your software update, then do not release something immediately. Roll out new changes gradually. Perhaps you could roll out a change in one country, preferably not one that is very populated, and then see what happens. See what happens in the smaller population and if it works out well. And then, if things go well, roll it out to the rest of the world. And you know who does this? Meta. Meta, the successful, big, and sometimes scary company. For example, they wanted to see what would happen if the number of likes was hidden on a post. So they tried this feature in Australia first. They didn't roll it out to everybody. They started with Australia. And then they decided not to release it in other places. Good for them. This is the way to do it. So again, if you're buying new software, you could say, has it been tested and has it been used by somebody else? What is your rollout process for new software? Lesson number 4. Engineers should know all of these things that I've taught you here because they are basic. But there is often a disconnect between the engineers and the business side, and sadly that does actually happen quite often. And engineers can sometimes be pushed to release more quickly than they think is safe. Honestly, this is quite a difficult problem to solve because you have to give engineers deadlines. Engineers, they like making stuff. They like making products. But they don't actually like market feedback. So they don't actually like releasing their products. They just want to carry on perfecting something. So if you don't give engineers a deadline, they're just going to carry on fiddling with something and you're never going to release anything. And by the way, if you want to see what happens when engineers have no deadline, watch a documentary called General Magic on iTunes. The bottom line is, if the business side and the tech side do not have a positive relationship and open communication, then bad things happen because there's going to be distrust and there's going to be misunderstanding. And these bad things include national health services and airlines not working. So they're serious bad things, not just people not sitting next to each other at a lunch table. This is why the business side has to learn to speak tech, and equally the tech side needs to explain clearly what the risks are. So just ask yourself today, am I in an organization where the two sides understand each other? Do we respect each other? Do we get on? If not, then start building human relationships, because if the relationship between the tech side and the business side is not good, then basically how are you going to solve problems together and trust each other? So start working on this human relationship. Maybe ask somebody out to lunch. See, I told you this wasn't going to be difficult or technical. Literally, I'm telling you to take people out to lunch and make friends. It's not that hard. You can totally do it. And finally, lesson number 5. Do not release new software on a Friday. This is so basic, but it's true. The CrowdStrike release was on a Friday, and look what happened. Do you think the CrowdStrike or Microsoft teams had a particularly nice weekend then? Did they get much sleep? Did they see their families? No, they did not. It was a bloody nightmare. And this is going back to my first point. Mistakes happen. Expect them to happen. Make room to correct them. Make time to correct them. Releasing something new on a Friday to a global group of users is literally saying, my work is perfect and there will be no problems. It is the definition of hubris. So if you are in a position to choose a big IT provider, ask them what I just taught you. What is their protocol for when things go wrong? How do they roll out new software updates? And you could even say, I don't want the CrowdStrike disaster or the post office to happen here. How are you going to mitigate that? Now that you know some basics of what to look for, you can see what's a sensible answer and what isn't. And obviously, if you are making a big purchasing decision, yes, you probably want to have your CIO or CTO or some sort of technical expert with you. But the key is with you, not instead of you. We're living in a time when software underpins so much of what we do. And you do not have to be the person in charge of making the software to understand the basics of how it works. And with this lesson, today you've taken a step further to being somebody who can really lead with intelligence in the digital age, because that means understanding how software is made and understanding how to collaborate with your tech colleagues, and most importantly, understanding how to mitigate tech risk. And this is what we've done here. And honestly, well done. I salute you for listening to this, because you could have been listening to Taylor Swift. I mean, she's fabulous, but instead you chose to educate yourself. So good on you. You can now go listen to Taylor Swift. And if you found this episode insightful, then please leave the show a rating and a review. Honestly, it really, really does help me so much, and it helps me reach more smart people like you. So basically, more free education to clever people. That's a great thing. And on that note, thank you very much for listening, and have a wonderful day. Ciao.